There are a number of reasons that I have us look at A Jury of Her Peers. It is a short story, but it was actually first a play that Susan Glaspell wrote. That book, that play, Trifles, is one of our reading assignments for drama. It is the same story, but I want us to look at it first from the perspective of the short story. First of all, let's put ourselves in space and time. We are in Mrs. Wright's kitchen. That's where the majority of the story takes place, and that's where the play takes place, is in the kitchen at the Wrights' farm. The story was first written in the story was written and first published in 1917. At that point in time, women did not have the right to vote, and certainly women did not serve on juries. Now, these are pictures that would have been consistent with the kind of kitchen most people would have had during this period of time. It is a place where an individual has to work very hard. Notice that there is reference to the roller towel, and that would be simply a towel that is sort of sewn together, instead of there being a beginning and an end, there would have been a circuit, a circle, so that you could pull it down and it wouldn't come off. But this was evidently something that would have been sort of unique and would have been considered to be a modern kind of thing that a person would have used, a convenience. There are several references to what Ms. Wright has canned. They talk about her cherries. But remember that in order to do that, she would have been working in what we would consider a fairly primitive kitchen. But notice that this would be something she would have been doing to preserve what was grown in the spring and the summer for consumption in the winter. So this is about preparation and about putting away things to be used later. They reference her clothing, which would have been very simple. Her dress most likely would have been a shift, and her apron, rather than being the kind we think of in the bottom right, may have been more like the pattern in the middle of the page, or like the one on the image in the top right. You notice also that it mentions that she remade her clothes. That is, she took things apart and put them back together in a new configuration. So again, the idea of being very simple, being frugal. But as we go back, we have an early 20th century kitchen. Mr. Wright has been murdered. He is not viewed as a villain. He is referred to as a good man because he pays his debts. He's not a drunk. He's honest. He keeps his word. But he's a hard man. He does nothing that does not have a purpose or a reason. There is nothing frivolous in his life. And it is into this environment that a canary enters. And a canary sings. So we would put into this situation a bird that is small and frail and contributes company and sound. There is also a reference to quilting or knotting. And here you see a picture of a young woman who is quilting, and you see what a quilted quilt looks like. That means that there is a pattern of stitches that hold together the back, the filling, and the top of the quilt, as opposed to on the right, knotting. So rather than sewing along each seam, a thread is brought from the bottom, and then it is tied together. It is knotted. We talk about finding meaning in a story. We want to know why the characters are at the farmhouse, why the men are there, and why the women are there. The men are there looking for clues. The women are there to gather things together. And notice what the observations by the women reveal about Mrs. Wright and Mr. Wright. we learn about Mrs. Wright as a young woman, and we learn about how her life changed. The things around in the kitchen and that the women gather reveal truths about this woman, about the frugality with which she lived, and about the isolation that she experiences. Notice that the men comment on the women, and that reveals things about their opinions of the women. We also see that the men refer to the kitchen and what's there and what women are concerned with as unimportant. But we learn through the course of the story that there are things in the kitchen that have special significance. Everything from the cherries and the roller towel and the way she kept house to the obvious clues that we find. And we also see that there are elements within the kitchen that can have symbolic meaning. Notice that during this period of time, women did not serve as jurors. And our story title is A Jury of Her Peers. So we can consider how these women served as the jury for the crime which Mrs. Wright committed. We can look at how the evidence collected by the men is different from the evidence collected by the women. What kind of reasoning? The men are coming to find a cause. The women are simply looking at the world that they are in and finding information from which they reach understanding. And think in terms of how the reasoning they use is consistent with the other tasks for which they are responsible. Think about making a quilt, taking pieces that seem unrelated and putting them together. What is the irony in that? The men's attitudes, what the women do, how the men view what the women do, and what actually transpires in the story. Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are termed a jury of peers, and that has significance. Why is it significant? When we look for theme, we look for central unifying concepts that provide insight and understanding. We can look at the nature of humanity, its essential qualities or characteristics. We can look at the nature of society, the nature of humankind's or mankind's relationship to the world. And we can look at the nature of our ethical responsibilities. Remember that theme is stated as a generalization, and it's a conclusion we come to after we have analyzed the work. It accounts for major details, it's not contradicted, and while we may have various interpretations, they must be supported by evidence within the story itself. When we think in terms of finding meaning, we can also look at the idea of justice and the idea of ethics. Justice is fairness or reasonableness. It is validity in the law. It is the quality of being just, righteous, equitable, and moral. It is rightful or lawful, a moral principle that determines conduct. And it can also mean or be understood in terms of a deserved punishment. So when we look at this story as a whole, and we look at the legal system, how is justice served? Is Mrs. Wright found guilty based on circumstantial evidence? And if she is, how do we then view the ethics, the principles of fairness, the fact that the punishment should be proportionate to the offense, and the fact that law is administered based on a fair understanding of the world? When we look at this story, we look at the world of men and the world of women. The men's world is one of important matters, but those are seen in contrast to the insignificance or trivial manners with which the men believed the women were concerned. They say they wouldn't know a clue if they saw it. The men's view of the women is one that is patronizing in some regards, but women are viewed to be less than the men. The women's world is centered on the kitchen, order, food, warmth, fire, making quilts and clothing, preparing for the future. If we think about what the women are responsible for, these are really essential elements. However, they are not worldly. They are contained within the house. And you'll notice that the women are seen as an extension of the husband. See how Mrs. Peters is discussed, who she is seen as being an extension of, her husband. Notice that the women are referred to by their married names, Mrs., as opposed to their first names. And that would have been consistent with the period of time in which the story was written. Notice that there are conflicts. The conflicts between the men and women, the gravity of the roles that they play in the world. There is a conflict between Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, and as they discuss what they're finding and how they're going to respond. Each woman has an internal conflict, a conflict that she has to resolve on her own. And then there is a conflict with our expectations for justice, our expectations for legality, our expectations for what is right or moral. The point of view in this story is dramatic. We have a story that is shown to us, and then we have to interpret. So here we are in this woman's kitchen, trying her for a murder that she committed, one that she is evidently guilty of. And we must consider, how is justice served? And if these women truly served as a jury of her peers? And if so, what does that say about us and about the world in which we live?